The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered wooden walls of Silver Creek's community hall, where townsfolk had gathered to discuss the upcoming harvest and land disputes. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and judgment, both equally suffocating to Clara Morrison as she sat rigid beside her husband, trying to make herself smaller in the crowded room. "Would you look at that?" came a sharp whisper from behind, loud enough to carry across several rows of benches. The Morrison girl, sitting there proud as you please, after throwing away her family's good name for a dirt farmer. Clara's fingers tightened on the rough fabric of her simple calico dress, a far cry from the silk gowns that once filled her wardrobe. Beside her, Joshua Bennett remained still as stone, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees, though she could see the muscle working in his jaw. The whispers grew bolder, feeding off each other like prairie fire in dry grass. "Her father must be turning in his grave," someone muttered. "All that education, all those opportunities, and she chooses him?" Mrs. Blackwood, resplendent in imported velvet despite the heat, turned in her seat to fix Clara with a look of theatrical pity. The wealthy widow commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout Silver Creek, her late husband's railroad fortune ensuring her word carried more weight than the mayor's. "Such a shame," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You could have had your pick of suitable men. Dear, the banker's son from Denver was quite taken with you, I recall. Now look where your romantic notions have led you, to a two-room shack and calloused hands." The crowd tittered, emboldened by Mrs. Blackwood's open disdain. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the injustice of it all. These people knew nothing of Joshua's gentle strength, his quiet wisdom, or the way he could calm a spooked horse with just a whisper. They saw only his patched clothes and sun-darkened skin, measuring a man's worth by the weight of his purse rather than the content of his character. "At least my husband earned his land through honest work," Clara said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "Not everyone can say the same." The hall fell silent for a moment, the implied accusation hanging in the air like dust motes in the afternoon light. Everyone knew how certain fortunes in Silver Creek had been built, through questionable land grabs and the exploitation of desperate homesteaders, but no one dared speak of it openly. "Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed to slits. "Careful, child. You've already fallen far enough. Don't dig yourself deeper." Joshua finally moved, placing one calloused hand over Clara's smaller one. The simple gesture spoke volumes, a reminder that she wasn't alone, that their choice to marry had been made with full hearts despite the cost. "My wife speaks truth," Joshua said quietly, his deep voice carrying the kind of authority that came not from wealth but from integrity. "We may not have much, but what we have, we've earned. Can't say I'm ashamed of that." Sheriff Daniels, who'd been dozing in the corner, suddenly perked up at the tension crackling through the room. His allegiance to the Blackwood money was an open secret, his badge tarnished by more than just time. "Now, folks," the sheriff drawled, "let's keep things civil. We're here to discuss community matters, not personal grievances." But Mrs. Blackwood wasn't finished. She rose from her seat, her substantial frame casting a shadow across the young couple. "Personal grievances? Sheriff, when members of our community make choices that reflect poorly on all of us, it becomes everyone's concern. This girl had everything: education, refinement, prospects, and she threw it all away for what? Love?" She spat the word like it tasted bitter. "Love doesn't put food on the table or keep a roof from leaking." The crowd murmured agreement, heads nodding like wheat in the wind. Clara felt their judgment pressing down on her, heavier than the heat. She'd known this would happen when she'd chosen Joshua over the life her family had planned for her. But knowing and experiencing were two different things entirely. "You're right, Mrs. Blackwood," Clara said, standing to face the older woman. "Love doesn't pay bills, but Joshua does, every day. He works from dawn to dusk. Honest work that feeds families and keeps this town running. While others sit in parlors counting money they didn't earn, he's out there. A sharp whistle cut through her words, long and low, rolling in from the hills beyond the town. It wasn't like any bird call or signal Clara had heard before. There was something deliberate about it, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Joshua's entire demeanor changed. His relaxed posture straightened, his eyes sharpening as they turned toward the sound. Around the room, Clara noticed others reacting too. The blacksmith's apprentice, the old prospector everyone called Crazy Pete, even the supposedly deaf stable hand. They all turned toward that whistle like flowers following the sun. "What was that, Mrs.?" Blackwood demanded, her composure cracking slightly at the unexpected interruption. Joshua stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. "Sounds like this meeting might be ending early," he said, his voice carrying an edge Clara had never heard before. Some things are more important than gossip. The whistle came again, 3 short bursts this time, and Joshua's face went granite hard. He turned to Clara, his eyes soft despite the tension in his jaw. "We need to go home. This is highly irregular." "Mrs." Blackwood sputtered. "You can't just leave in the middle of—" "Watch me," Joshua said simply, taking Clara's arm and guiding her toward the door. As they passed through the crowd, Clara caught glimpses of faces, some confused, others knowing, and a few wearing expressions of what looked almost like anticipation. The blacksmith's apprentice was already moving toward the door, as was Crazy Pete, his shuffling gait suddenly purposeful. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the dusty main street in shades of gold and amber. Joshua helped Clara onto their modest wagon, his hands gentle but urgent. As he took up the reins, Clara couldn't hold back her questions any longer. "Joshua, what was that sound? Why did those men react to it?" He glanced at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Clara saw something in his eyes that might have been fear, not for himself, but for her. "That whistle means trouble's coming," he said, urging the horses into a quick trot, the kind of trouble that doesn't knock polite-like at the front door. Behind them, Clara could hear the community hall erupting in confusion and speculation. "Mrs." Blackwood's shrill voice rose above the rest, demanding answers that no one seemed willing or able to provide. As their wagon rolled toward home, Clara noticed riders in the distance, moving fast across the range. The whistle came once more, from a different direction this time, and Joshua's hands tightened on the reins. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "remember that I love you, and that everything I've done, everything I am, has been to build a life worthy of that love." Clara pressed closer to him on the wagon seat, her heart racing with equal parts fear and fierce pride. She'd chosen this man not despite his simple ways, but because of them. Now, as shadows lengthened across the prairie and that mysterious whistle echoed through the valleys, she sensed that there was far more to Joshua Bennett than even she had guessed. The simple rancher she'd married was about to reveal himself as something else entirely, and Clara Morrison Bennett was ready to stand beside him, whatever came next. The ranch house stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its simple wooden frame a testament to Joshua's handiwork. Clara lit the oil lamps while her husband secured the horses, his movements quick but methodical. Through the window, she watched him scan the horizon, his shoulders tense with an alertness she'd rarely seen in their 6 months of marriage. Inside their modest home, Clara moved to prepare supper, but her hands trembled as she reached for the coffee pot. The memory of Mrs. Blackwood's cutting words still stung, mixing with a deeper ache she tried to push away. Once, she'd dined on fine china with silver cutlery. Once, she'd had servants to prepare her meals and draw her baths. Once, her biggest worry had been choosing between suitors who showered her with expensive gifts and promises of comfortable lives. "You're not having second thoughts, are you?" Joshua's voice from the doorway made her jump, He stood there, his broad frame filling the space, concern etched across his weathered features. In the lamplight, she could see the premature lines around his eyes, carved by sun and wind and harder things she was only beginning to understand. "No," Clara said quickly. Then, more honestly, "Maybe not about you, Joshua, never about you. But sometimes I wonder if I was selfish, choosing love over everything else." He crossed to her in 3 strides, his work-roughened hands gentle as they took hers. "You chose honest work and honest love over pretty lies and golden cages. Nothing selfish in that." "But what kind of life can I give our children?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, the secret she'd been carrying for 2 weeks spilling into the space between them. "When they come, what inheritance will they have? My family disowned me, yours." She trailed off, realizing she knew almost nothing about Joshua's family. He'd mentioned parents who died when he was young, a harder life before he'd saved enough to buy this small ranch. But the details remained locked away like treasures in a chest she didn't have the key to. Joshua's eyes widened at her revelation, then softened with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Children?" he whispered, one hand moving to hover over her still flat stomach. "Clara, are you—" She nodded, tears threatening. "I found out for certain last week. I wanted to tell you properly, not like this, not when everything feels so uncertain." He pulled her close, his embrace solid and warm, and everything she'd given up her old life to find. "Our children will have something worth more than money," he murmured against her hair. "They'll have parents who chose each other, who built something real together. They'll know what it means to work for what they have and to stand tall despite what others think." A thunderous pounding on the door shattered the moment. Joshua released her instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. His hand went to the rifle mounted above the fireplace, though he didn't take it down yet. "Bennett!" a rough voice shouted from outside. "We know you're in there. Time to pay what you owe." Clara recognized the voice. Tom Garrett, one of Mrs. Blackwood's hired hands, a man with cruel eyes and crueler hands. Through the window, she could see torches flickering in the darkness. Her heart counted at least a dozen men, maybe more. "I don't owe anybody anything," Joshua called back, his voice steady. "You're on my land uninvited. I'll ask you once to leave peaceable-like." Harsh laughter answered him. "Your land? Not after tonight. It won't be Mrs. Blackwood's decided this ranch would make a fine addition to her holdings. Sheriff Daniels even drew up the papers. Seems you've been defaulting on taxes you didn't know you had." Clara gasped. It was an old trick, one her father had whispered about in his study when he thought she wasn't listening. Powerful people would arrange for false tax bills, then seize the land when desperate farmers couldn't pay debts they'd never actually incurred. "Those are lies," Clara shouted before Joshua could stop her. "We've paid every tax, every fee. I have the receipts." "Receipts can burn," Garrett replied, and the threat in his voice made Clara's blood run cold. "Just like houses and barns and everything else that gets in Mrs. Blackwood's way." The sound of splintering wood came from the direction of the barn. Through the window, Clara could see men tearing down the fence Joshua had spent weeks building, others chasing their milk cow and the handful of horses that constituted their entire wealth. One man held a torch dangerously close to the hay stored for winter feed. "Please," Clara whispered, her hand finding Joshua's arm. "Maybe we should just start over somewhere else. It's not worth—" "Yes, it is," Joshua said quietly, his eyes never leaving the men outside. "This is our home, our land, our future." He glanced at her stomach with a fierce protectiveness that took her breath away. "Their future. I won't run from bullies and thieves, no matter how rich they are." More sounds of destruction reached them, the chicken coop being overturned, the vegetable garden Clara had tended so carefully being trampled. Each sound was like a physical blow. Months of hard work destroyed in minutes by men who saw their modest dreams as obstacles to be removed. "Last chance, Bennett." Garrett called. "Sign the papers the sheriff sent. Take the pittance, Mrs. Blackwood's offering, and get out by sunrise. Or things get unpleasant for that pretty wife of yours." Joshua's control finally snapped. He grabbed the rifle and headed for the door, but Clara caught his arm. "Don't! That's what they want! An excuse to say you attacked them! Joshua, please! Think!" He paused, his whole body vibrating with suppressed rage. In that moment, Clara saw not the gentle rancher who sang to horses and carved toys for the neighbors' children, but something else, something dangerous and barely leashed. "I need you to trust me," he said finally, setting the rifle aside. "Whatever happens next, whatever you see or hear, I need you to remember that everything I've done has been to protect what matters. Can you do that?" Clara nodded, though fear made her throat tight. "What are you going to do?" Instead of answering directly, Joshua moved to their bedroom and pulled out a small wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was something Clara had never seen before: papers, a few photographs, and what looked like military medallions. "I wasn't always a rancher," he said softly, his fingers tracing over the items. "There was a time when I led good men who trusted me to keep them alive in impossible situations. Men who swore oaths that went beyond any law or border." The pounding came again, more insistent. "Time's wasting, Bennett." Joshua looked at Clara, and in his eyes she saw the weight of secrets, the burden of a past he'd tried to leave behind. "Those men out there think they're dealing with a simple rancher? They're wrong, but I need to know. If I show you who I really am, who I was, will you still stand beside me?" Clara didn't hesitate. "Always." He kissed her then, fierce and quick, before moving to the door. But instead of opening it, he went to the window facing away from the mob, in the darkness beyond. Clara thought she saw movement, shadows that didn't match the wind's pattern in the grass. "One more thing," Joshua said, pulling out a silver whistle on a chain from the box. It was intricately carved with symbols Clara didn't recognize, worn smooth in places by years of handling. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone like us, every small rancher, every honest family trying to build something real. The Blackwoods of this world have taken enough." He raised the whistle to his lips, and the sound that emerged was different from what they'd heard in town. Longer, more complex, like a song of summoning played in a key that spoke directly to the soul. Outside, Garrett had run out of patience. "Burn it down," he shouted. "Burn it all!" But before his men could move, an answering whistle came from the darkness. Then another, and another, until the night itself seemed to be singing Joshua's call back to him. The mob hesitated, torches wavering as they tried to peer into the suddenly alive darkness beyond their circle of light. "What did you do?" Clara whispered, awed and terrified in equal measure. Joshua pulled her close, his voice grim but satisfied. "I reminded some old friends that the war isn't always over just because the treaties are signed, and that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how long it's been since you wore a uniform." The torches outside began to go out one by one, and the shouting turned from threats to confusion, then to something very like fear. Clara held tight to her husband, feeling the solid strength of him, the core of steel she'd always sensed beneath his gentle exterior. "Tomorrow, they'll be back," she said, "with more men, with the sheriff." "Maybe," Joshua agreed. "But tonight, they'll learn that Joshua Bennett isn't as alone as they thought. And by tomorrow," he smiled, dark and promising. "By tomorrow, neither will they be." The night erupted in chaos outside, but inside their small home, Clara felt safer than she ever had in her father's mansion. She'd chosen this man for his kindness, his integrity, his quiet strength. Now she was discovering that still waters didn't just run deep. Sometimes they concealed currents strong enough to reshape the world. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over Silver Creek, matching Clara's mood as she hitched up her skirts and marched toward the sheriff's office. Joshua had tried to stop her, warning that Sheriff Daniels was deeper in Mrs. Blackwood's pocket than a silver dollar. But Clara's Morrison stubbornness, the one trait her father had always despaired of, wouldn't be denied. The town was already stirring. Shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts and early risers gathering at the general store to share gossip about the previous night's commotion. Clara felt their eyes following her, heard the whispers that trailed in her wake like dust devils. "That's the Bennett woman," someone murmured. "Heard there was trouble at their place last night." "Trouble she brought on herself," another replied. "Putting on airs, thinking she's better than honest folk just because she can read Latin." Clara kept her chin high, though each word stung like a nettle. She'd never thought herself better than anyone, if anything. She'd fallen in love with Joshua precisely because he'd shown her what real worth looked like, stripped of pretense and social positioning. The sheriff's office squatted at the end of Main Street like a toad made of weathered wood and false authority. Clara pushed through the door without knocking, finding Sheriff Daniels with his boots up on his desk, studying what looked suspiciously like property deeds. "Mrs. Bennett," he drawled, not bothering to stand or remove his hat. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to report vandalism, perhaps destruction of property, threatening behavior by unknown persons in the dead of night?" The mock innocence in his voice made Clara's hands clench in her skirts. "You know exactly why I'm here. Sheriff, Tom Garrett and a dozen men attacked our ranch last night. They destroyed property, scattered our livestock, and threatened our lives. I demand you arrest them." Daniels slowly lowered his feet, his chair creaking as he leaned forward. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am. You got any witnesses? Any proof it was Garrett and not just some drifters passing through?" "My husband and I both saw—" "Your husband?" The sheriff's smile was cold as a winter creek. The same husband who, according to several upstanding citizens, threatened Mr. Garrett and his associates when they came to discuss a legitimate business proposition? "Seems to me your husband might be the one facing charges, if anyone pressed the matter." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. They'd already rewritten the story, turned victims into aggressors with the casualties of men who'd done it before. "That's a lie and you know it." "Do I?" Daniel stood now, his considerable bulk throwing shadows across the wanted posters on the wall. "What I know is that Mrs. Blackwood is a pillar of this community, a woman of unimpeachable character who's done more for Silver Creek than a dozen ranchers scratching in the dirt. If she says your husband owes taxes, well," he shrugged, "the law's the law." "Show me these tax bills," Clara demanded. "Show me the legal documentation that says we owe anything beyond what we've already paid." The sheriff's smile widened. "Funny thing about paperwork. Sometimes it gets misfiled. Sometimes it takes a while to find. Could be days, weeks even, before I locate those particular documents. Meanwhile, if folks feel unsafe around your husband, if they feel threatened—" He let the implication hang like a noose in the air. Clara turned to leave, disgust and fury warring in her chest. When the door burst open, old Silas McKenna stumbled in, his grizzled face split by a grin that revealed more gaps than teeth. The prospector was a fixture in Silver Creek, known for his wild tales and wilder appearance, most folks dismissing him as touched in the head from too many years alone in the mountains. "Sheriff!" Silas exclaimed, then noticed Clara. His rheumy eyes sharpened with surprising clarity. Well, Mrs. Bennett, how's that husband of yours? Still got the steadiest hand with a rifle this side of the Rockies?" Daniels frowned. "Silas, this is official business. Get on out of here before I—" "Before you what?" Silas asked, his voice suddenly steadier, less addled. "Arrest me? On what charge? Being old? Being grateful?" He turned to Clara, and she saw something in his expression that made her pause. "Your husband ever tell you about the winter of '74, when the McKenna mine played out and I was fixing to starve?" Clara shook her head slowly, aware that the sheriff had gone very still. 20 below, Silas continued, and me with nothing but pride and an empty belly. Would have died in that mountain shack if a young soldier hadn't come along. Shared his rations, even though he barely had enough for himself. Stayed 3 days to make sure I didn't freeze. Never asked for nothing in return. Just said folks ought to help folks when they can. That's a touching story, Daniels interrupted. But it's got nothing to do with... Doesn't it? Silas asked. See, that soldier had a whistle, silver thing, with markings I'd never seen. Said it was from his unit, something they used to find each other when regular army discipline wasn't enough. Said those who answered that call were bound by something stronger than law or country. The prospector reached into his coat and pulled out his own whistle, brass rather than silver, but with similar markings. Clara's breath caught. 43 men, Silas said quietly. That's how many answered the call last night. 43 men who remember what Joshua Bennett did for them when the world turned its back. You might want to mention that to Mrs. Blackwood. Sheriff, let her know that some debts can't be collected with false papers and hired thugs. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Sheriff, you might want to check your own taxes. Funny how paperwork can get misfiled. Like you said, be a shame if someone found records of all those payments from Mrs. Blackwood that somehow never made it to the town treasury. The old man shuffled out, leaving Clara and the sheriff in tense silence. Daniel's face had gone from red to white and back again, his hands clenching and unclenching like he was fighting the urge to reach for his gun. You tell your husband, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous, that tricks and old favors won't protect him forever. This is a new world, and men like him, men who think honor and loyalty matter more than progress. They're relics, fossils, and fossils get ground to dust. Clara met his gaze steadily. Maybe so, Sheriff, but at least fossils were once something real, something that lived and breathed and stood for something. What are you, besides Mrs. Blackwood's pet dog? She left before he could respond, her heart hammering as she stepped back into the morning light. The encounter with Silas had revealed more questions than answers. Who was Joshua, really? This soldier who'd saved lives and inspired loyalty that lasted decades? And how many more men would answer if he called again? As she walked back through town, Clara noticed things she'd missed on the way in. The blacksmith's apprentice, watching her from his forge with a knowing nod. The stable hand, tipping his hat with deliberate respect. Even the baker's wife, who'd snubbed her for months, offered a small smile through her shop window. They knew. Somehow, word had already spread about the night's events, about the whistle and the men who'd answered it, the town that had seemed uniformly against her, and Joshua now revealed hidden currents, secret sympathies, silent allies who'd been waiting for someone to stand up to the Blackwoods of the world. By the time Clara reached the edge of town, Silas had caught up with her, moving with surprising speed for his apparent age. Walk with an old man a spell? He asked, and Clara nodded. Thank you, she said simply, for what you said in there. Silas chuckled. Weren't nothing but truth. Your husband saved my life, sure enough, but that ain't the whole of it. He glanced around, making sure they weren't overheard. That unit he mentioned? Weren't just any military outfit. They called themselves the Grey Wolves. Special duties, the kind that don't make it into history books. When the war ended, officially they disbanded. But men who've seen what they've seen, done what they've done, those bonds don't break easy. And they all settled here, near Silver Creek? Not all, but enough. Scattered across 3 states, living quiet lives, trying to forget. But they remember the whistle. They remember what it means when a brother calls. Silas stopped walking, his weathered hand catching Clara's arm gently. Your husband gave us purpose when the world said we were done, gave us honor when everyone else saw only killers. That's a debt that compounds interest every year it ain't paid. Clara thought of Joshua, quiet and gentle, singing to horses and crafting furniture with patient hands. Tried to reconcile that image with the soldier Silas described, the leader of dangerous men bound by oaths that transcended ordinary law. He's never told me, she said softly, about any of this. I reckon he hoped he'd never need to. Silas replied. Man tries to build a new life. He don't always want the old one following. But the Blackwoods of this world, they don't let men like your husband just be. They see strength and want to break it. See dignity and want to buy it. See love and want to prove it ain't worth nothing next to gold. They'd reached the turnoff to the Bennett Ranch. In the distance, Clara could see Joshua working to repair the damage from the night before, his movements steady and purposeful despite everything. Tell him Silas McKenna remembers, the old man said. Tell him the brass whistles are spreading the word to the silver ones. Tell him... He paused, his eyes distant with memory. Tell him the gray wolves never forgot their promise. When one calls, all answer. When one stands, all stand. When one fights, all fight, Clara finished, the words coming unbidden to her lips. Silas smiled, suddenly looking years younger. You'll do, Mrs. Bennett. You'll do just fine. He turned back toward town, his step lighter than before. Storm's coming, make no mistake. But this time, it ain't just one man standing against it. Mrs. Blackwood wanted to wake sleeping dogs. Well, she's about to learn that some dogs have teeth she never dreamed of. Clara watched him go, then turned toward home, toward her husband and the secrets he'd kept to protect her. The morning had revealed that Joshua Bennett wasn't just the simple rancher she'd married. He was something more complex, more dangerous, and somehow more worthy of her love than ever. The real battle for their future hadn't even begun. But now Clara knew they wouldn't face it alone. The old mine shaft yawned before them like a mouthful of secrets, its timber supports groaning with age and neglect. Joshua led Clara through the narrow entrance, their lantern casting dancing shadows on walls that hadn't seen light in years. The air tasted of earth and metal, and something else, the weight of hidden history. My father worked this claim before it played out, Joshua said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. When he died, everyone forgot about it, except me. They moved deeper, past rusted cart rails and abandoned tools, until they reached a natural chamber where the miners had followed a vein of ore that led nowhere. Here, Joshua had created something unexpected, shelves carved into the rock walls, covered with oilcloth to protect their contents from moisture. After the war, he said, setting the lantern on a natural ledge, I needed a place to put things I couldn't throw away but couldn't keep in the open, things that belonged to the man I used to be. He pulled back one of the cloths, revealing neat rows of items, military papers, wrapped in waxed cotton, photographs of men in uniform, their faces young and serious, maps marked with routes and positions that meant nothing to Clara but everything to the man beside her. And there, in a place of honor, a wooden case lined with velvet. Joshua opened it with reverent hands. Inside lay a silver whistle, identical to the one he'd used the night before, but somehow different, older, more ornate, with engravings that seemed to tell a story and symbols Clara couldn't read. This belonged to Captain Marcus Wade, Joshua said softly. Best man I ever served under. When he was dying at Antietam, gut shot and knowing it, he gave me this, said the whistles were more than signals. They were promises. Every man who carried one swore the same oath. He lifted the whistle, and Clara could see how his hands trembled slightly. I was just a sergeant then, barely 22, trying to keep 30 men alive in a war that seemed bent on killing us all. But Captain Wade, he saw something in me. Taught me that leadership wasn't about giving orders. It was about earning trust so complete that men would follow you into hell itself. The Gray Wolves, Clara said, remembering Silas's words. Joshua nodded. Special reconnaissance unit. We did the jobs nobody else wanted. Went places nobody else could survive. Behind enemy lines for weeks at a time. Living like ghosts. Gathering intelligence that saved thousands of lives. The regular army called us reckless. Our enemies called us worse. But we called each other brothers. He set the captain's whistle carefully back in its case and pulled out a leather journal, its pages yellow with age. Every man we'd lost, I wrote down. Every mission, every close call, every time one of us saved another's life. It's all here. The official records were sealed or destroyed. What we did was too irregular, too dangerous to acknowledge publicly. But I kept our real history. Clara took the journal with careful hands, opening it to a random page. Joshua's younger handwriting, neat despite what must have been difficult conditions, told of a night raid to rescue Union prisoners. The margin notes were different hands, his men adding their own memories, their own perspectives. It was like holding a piece of living history. After the war ended, Joshua continued, pulling out more items, medals never officially awarded, a flag with bullet holes through it, a collection of different whistles in brass and pewter and silver. We scattered. Some went home to families who didn't recognize the men they'd become. Others had no homes left to return to, but we kept the whistles, kept the promise. If one called, all would answer. But you became a rancher, Clara said. You left all this behind. I tried to. His smile was rueful. Bought this land with my mustering out pay and what I'd saved. Figured I'd raised enough hell for one lifetime. Time to raise cattle instead. Build something instead of tearing it down. And for a while, it worked. The other wolves, they did the same, became farmers, shopkeepers, miners, anything but soldiers. We were done with violence. He moved to another section of the cache, revealing something that made Clara gasp. Weapons, not just guns, but specialized equipment she'd never seen before. Collapsible rifles, knives with hidden compartments, devices she couldn't even identify. Then, men like Mrs. Blackwood started pushing, Joshua said, his voice hardening, taking land through legal trickery, destroying families who'd done nothing but try to build honest lives. And I realized something. The war wasn't over. It just changed uniform. Instead of blue and gray, it wore bankers' suits and lawyers' robes. Instead of cannons, it used foreclosures and hired thugs. A sound from outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on the rocky path leading to the mine. Joshua immediately doused the lantern, pulling Clara behind him as he drew a concealed pistol from his boot. "Bennett," a voice called. "It's Marcus Thompson. Silas said you'd be here." Joshua relaxed fractionally. "Come in slow, Marcus, and alone." A man entered, tall and lean with the economical movements of someone accustomed to danger. His clothes were those of a prosperous merchant, but his eyes belonged to a soldier. "Joshua," he said, then noticed Clara. "Ma'am, pleasure to finally meet the woman who captured our sergeant's heart." Marcus ran the most successful raids behind Confederate lines, Joshua explained. Now he runs the most successful general store in 3 counties. Funny how skills transfer. Marcus's smile was sharp. "Speaking of skills, we've got a problem. Mrs. Blackwood's brought in professional guns from Denver. Pinkerton men, or something close enough. They're not like Garrett and his bullies. These are killers who know their business." "How many?" 20, maybe more. And Joshua." Marcus paused, his expression grave. "They've got Henry Colton with them." Clara felt Joshua go absolutely still beside her. "Colton's dead. I saw him fall at Cold Harbor." "Apparently not. Or not permanently. He's older, scarred to hell. But it's him. Walking with a limp from where you put that bullet in his hip. And carrying a grudge that's had 12 years to fester." Clara looked between the two men. "Who's Henry Colton?" "Confederate Special Operations," Joshua said quietly. "Their answer to the Grey Wolves. We tangled more than once during the war. Last time, his unit ambushed us during what was supposed to be a prisoner exchange. Killed 8 of my men before we could respond. He paused, his jaw tight. "I made sure he wouldn't do it again. Or so I thought." "He knows about the whistles," Marcus added. "Knows our signals, our methods. If Mrs. Blackwood wanted an edge against us, She couldn't have picked better. Joshua turned back to his cache, pulling out items with swift efficiency. Then we need to move fast. Marcus, send word to the others. Not just the local boys. I want every wolf within 3 days' ride to know what's happening. Tell them it's not a request. And if they ask why they should risk everything they've built for one ranch? Joshua looked at Clara, then back at his old comrade. Because it's not about one ranch. It's about whether men like us get to live in peace or have to keep fighting the same war in different clothes. Because if they can take what's ours here, they can take it anywhere. And because, he pulled out the captain's whistle, because I'm calling in every debt, every favor, every drop of blood we shed together. This ends here, one way or another. Marcus nodded, understanding perfect. I'll need 2 days to reach everyone. You've got one. Colton won't wait once he knows I'm aware of him. Joshua handed Marcus a leather pouch. Gold for supplies and ammunition. Don't be stingy. We're going to need everything. After Marcus left, Clara found herself staring at the man she'd married, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. You're preparing for war. I'm preparing to protect what's mine, he corrected. But his eyes were soldier's eyes now, calculating angles and distances and probabilities of survival. Clara, I need you to understand something. When this starts, and it will start, probably within days, it won't be clean or simple. The man I was, the things I'm capable of. You might not like what you see. She thought of their unborn child, of the home they'd built, of the quiet life they'd tried to claim. Then she thought of Mrs. Blackwood's sneering face, of Sheriff Daniels's corruption, of all the small cruelties that passed for business as usual in their world. Show me, she said simply. What? Show me how to load those guns. Show me where to stand, what to watch for. If we're going to fight, then I need to know how. She met his surprised gaze steadily. I'm not the delicate flower they think I am. Joshua Bennett, I chose you. I chose this life, and I'll defend it alongside you. For a moment, his soldier's mask slipped, and she saw the man underneath. Surprised, proud, and fiercely protective all at once. Then he smiled, and it was neither the gentle rancher's smile nor the dangerous soldier's grin, but something uniquely theirs. All right, he said, pulling out a lightweight rifle. First lesson. This is a Spencer carbine, modified for accuracy over distance. 7 shots, .52 caliber, and it'll punch through most cover at reasonable range. You load it like this. As Clara learned the basics of warfare in a forgotten mine shaft, she realized that the simple rancher she'd married had never really existed, but the complex, dangerous, honorable man teaching her to defend their home, he was worth more than all the simple safety her old life had offered. The silver whistle caught the lamplight as Joshua demonstrated shooting positions, and Clara understood that it wasn't just a signal. It was a symbol of bonds forged in extremity, of honor that transcended law, of men who'd given up everything except their loyalty to each other. Soon, those bonds would be tested. But first, Clara Bennett was going to learn how to fight beside her husband. The society matrons of Silver Creek would be scandalized. She found she didn't care at all. The morning sun painted the hills in shades of gold and amber as Joshua climbed to the highest point on their property, a rocky outcrop that commanded views across 3 valleys. Clara watched from below, her heart tight with anticipation and dread in equal measure. In his hand, the silver whistle caught the light like a promise about to be fulfilled. He stood there for a long moment, silhouetted against the sky, and Clara was struck by how solitary he looked, one man against the vastness of the frontier. Then he raised the whistle to his lips, and the sound that emerged was unlike anything she'd heard before. It started low, almost mournful, like wind through a canyon at dusk. Then it rose, becoming stronger, more insistent, carrying notes of urgency and command that seemed to pierce straight through to the soul. The melody was complex, not just a signal, but a story, of shared trials, of bonds forged in blood. of promises that death itself couldn't break. The whistle's song rolled across the landscape, echoing off distant cliffs, carrying further than any normal sound should. Joshua played for nearly a minute, the notes varying in subtle ways Clara couldn't decode but suspected carried specific meaning to those who knew the language. When he finally lowered the whistle, the silence that followed seemed alive with possibility. "Somewhere?" a hawk cried, as if answering the call. Then Joshua played again, 3 short bursts this time, followed by 2 long notes that hung in the air like a battle flag. He climbed down slowly, his face grave. "It's done," he said simply. "Now we wait." They didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, a dust plume appeared on the eastern road. A lone rider, pushing his horse hard. As he drew closer, Clara recognized Samuel Chen, who ran a laundry in town. A quiet man most folks barely noticed. But the way he sat his horse, the way his eyes swept the terrain as he approached, spoke of skills that had nothing to do with washing clothes. "Sergeant," Chen said, swinging down from his mount. His accent was slight, refined. "The silver whistle calls. I answer." Joshua clasped his hand firmly. "Good to see you, Sam, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "The gray wolf doesn't choose when to hunt," Chen replied, an old saying that seemed to carry weight between them. "My nephew is bringing supplies from town. Medical provisions, ammunition, misses. Blackwood's people are watching the general store, but they don't pay attention to Chinese laundrymen coming and going." More dust clouds appeared from different directions. 2 riders from the north, another 3 from the west. By midday, Clara had lost count of the men gathering at their ranch. They came in all shapes and ages, some obviously former soldiers, others whose military past was hidden beneath farmers' overalls or merchant suits. Each greeted Joshua with the same simple formula. "The silver whistle calls. I answer." Clara found herself pressed into service, organizing food and water for the growing assembly. The men were polite, respectful, but she caught the way they watched the horizons, the way hands never strayed far from weapons. These weren't just veterans gathering for a reunion. They were wolves remembering how to hunt. Among them, she began to notice a hierarchy that had nothing to do with current social standing. The banker from Colville deferred to a half-breed tracker who owned nothing but his horse and guns. The prosperous cattle rancher took orders from a freedman who worked as a farrier. Whatever ranks they'd held in the Grey Wolves superseded everything else. "Ma'am?" a gravelly voice said, and Clara turned to find a mountain of a man with scarred hands and kind eyes. "Name's William Thornton. I was Joshua's corporal back in the day. Want to thank you for standing by him. Not every woman would understand why we do what we do." "I'm still learning," Clara admitted, watching Joshua conferring with a group of men over a hand-drawn map. "He never told me about any of this." "That's our Joshua," Thornton said with a fond smile. "Always trying to protect everyone, even from the truth. Man saved my life 4 times during the war. 4 times I should have died, and he pulled me through. You don't forget that. You don't walk away when a man like that needs you." As the sun reached its zenith, Clara counted 43 men, just as Silas had predicted. But these weren't all locals. Some had clearly ridden through the night from considerable distances. The whistle's call had reached further than she'd imagined possible. Joshua stood before them, no longer the gentle rancher, but the sergeant they remembered. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying easily across the assembled group. "You know why I called, Mrs. Blackwood wants to take what's ours through lies and hired guns. Sheriff's in her pocket. Law's been twisted to serve greed instead of justice. Sound familiar?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. These men had seen too much to believe in simple solutions or fair fights. "She's brought in professionals," Joshua continued, "including Henry Colton." The mood shifted instantly. Men who'd been relaxed suddenly tensed, hands checking weapons reflexively. Clara heard cursing in multiple languages. "Colton's Grey Wolves?" someone asked. "Confederate equivalent," Joshua confirmed. And just as dangerous as we are, maybe more, because he's had 12 years to nurse his hatred. This won't be like scaring off local thugs. This is going to be war. Then why are we sitting here talking? The speaker was a lean man with predator's eyes. We should hit them first, hard. Take the fight to them before they're ready. Because we're not killers anymore. Davis, Joshua said firmly. We're not the men we were. We've got families, homes, lives worth protecting. We do this smart, not bloody. The goal is to protect what's ours and expose Blackwood's corruption, not to paint the town red. He unrolled a larger map on a makeshift table. Here's what we know. Blackwood's men are camped here, about 2 miles from town. Colton's keeping them separate from the locals. Probably doesn't trust Garrett's bullies. They'll move against us tomorrow night. New moon, perfect for what Colton has in mind. How do you know? Chen asked. Joshua smiled grimly. Because it's what I'd do. Hit us in darkness. Make it look like we started it. Have the sheriff arrest any survivors for murder. Clean, legal, final. So we make sure they don't get that far. Thornton growled. Exactly, but we do it our way. Davis, I want you and your team here, controlling this ridge. Marcus, you'll take the eastern approach. Sam, the western flank is yours. Nobody gets to our ranch without going through one of you. As Joshua laid out the battle plan, Clara marveled at the transformation. The gentle man who sang to horses was gone, replaced by a tactical genius who could visualize terrain like a chessboard and move men like pieces in a grand game. Each squad leader received specific instructions, tailored to their strengths and the ground they'd hold. What about the law? Someone asked. When this is over, won't they just arrest us all? Let me worry about that. Joshua said, I've got documentation that'll bury Blackwood and Daniels both, if we survive to use it. But first, we need to make sure Colton doesn't succeed where Garrett failed. The meeting broke up into smaller groups, men renewing old partnerships, checking equipment, preparing for what was to come. Clara found herself surrounded by women she hadn't noticed arriving, wives and sisters who'd followed their men, understanding that this was bigger than one family's fight. You must be Clara, a steel-haired woman said, extending a work-roughened hand. I'm Martha Thompson, Marcus's wife. I've got medical training from the war, worked in the field hospitals. Figured you might need help with wounded when this is done. When, not if? Clara asked. Martha's smile was knowing. Honey, I've seen our men fight. The only question is how many of Blackwood's hired guns will be left to arrest when the dust settles. As afternoon wore toward evening, the ranch had transformed into an armed camp. Defensive positions were established, supplies distributed, weapons cleaned and loaded. But there was no chaos, no confusion. Every man knew his role, his place, his purpose. Joshua found Clara as the sun began to sink toward the mountains. I need you to understand, he said quietly. Tomorrow, you and the other women need to be in the root cellar. It's reinforced, defensible, and... No. He blinked at her flat refusal. Clara. I said no. Joshua, I've learned to shoot. I know the terrain. And this is my home too. I won't hide in a cellar while you fight for our future. She touched her still flat belly. Our child's future. I stand with you, or we both leave tonight. Choose. He studied her face, saw the Morrison stubbornness that had led her to choose him over comfort and safety in the first place. You're going to be the death of me, woman. No, she said firmly. I'm going to be the reason you live. Someone needs to watch your back while you're watching everyone else's. The silver whistle hung between them, catching the last light of day. Around them, 43 gray wolves prepared for one last hunt. Tomorrow, Henry Colton would learn what Joshua had tried to forget, that some bonds, once forged, could never truly be broken. The whistle had sung its song across the valleys and mountains. Now all that remained was to see who would be left standing when the music stopped. The dawn came blood-red over the hills, as if the sky itself knew what was coming. Clara stood beside Joshua on their porch, watching dust clouds rising in the distance. Too many and too organized to be anything but an armed force moving with purpose. "They're early," Joshua observed, his voice calm despite the tension Clara could feel radiating from him. Colton changed the plan. Smart move. A rifle shot cracked across the morning air, the signal from Davis's position on the ridge. The enemy was in sight. Mrs. Blackwood rode at the head of the column like a conquering queen, her black dress inappropriate for the frontier, but perfect for the statement she intended to make. Beside her, Sheriff Daniels looked uncomfortable on his horse, his badge glinting like a bad joke in the morning sun. Behind them, 24 hard-faced men rode in disciplined formation, and at their head, "Colton," Joshua breathed. The man was older, grayer, but unmistakable. He sat his horse like he'd been born to it, his eyes sweeping the terrain with professional assessment. When those eyes found Joshua on the porch, something passed between them. Recognition, old hatred, and perhaps a touch of respect for an enemy who'd survived as long as they both had. They stopped just outside rifle range, but Clara could see Mrs. Blackwood's smug expression clearly enough. The wealthy widow expected surrender, expected Joshua to crumble before her show of force. "Bennett," Sheriff Daniels called out, trying to sound authoritative. "You're under arrest for threatening behavior, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit violence against upstanding citizens." "Interesting charges," Joshua called back, "especially since I've been here all night with 43 witnesses." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Mrs. Blackwood's face. She turned to scan the property, and Clara saw her realize what Joshua had already known. The ranch looked empty, deserted even, except for the two figures on the porch. 43 witnesses? Mrs. Blackwood scoffed, recovering her composure. "I see only your wife. Bennett, have you lost your mind along with your sense of propriety?" "Ma'am." Colton spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the soft drawl of old Virginia. "I'd recommend we proceed careful-like. This ground, it's too perfect, too inviting." "Nonsense," Mrs. Blackwood snapped. "You said Bennett was dangerous. I see only a frightened rancher trying to bluff his way out of justice." But Colton wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on Joshua, reading something in the other man's stance, his stillness. "Sergeant Bennett," he said, loud enough to carry, "that whistle you called with, that was Captain Wade's, wasn't it? I'd recognize that silver tone anywhere." "It was," Joshua confirmed. "He gave it to me at Antietam, right after your boys ambushed our medical convoy." That was war. Colton said simply, "This doesn't have to be." "Mrs." Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "I'm not paying you for conversation. Mr. Colton! Do what I hired you to do." Colton sighed, and in that sound was the weight of old soldiers who'd seen too much. "Very well, but ma'am, when this goes bad, and it will go bad, remember that you ordered it." He raised his hand, and his men began to spread out in a practiced maneuver, seeking to encircle the ranch house. They moved well, Clara had to admit, like a machine oiled by years of violent practice. That's when the prairie came alive. From hidden positions dug overnight, from behind rocks and rises that seemed too small to conceal a man, the gray wolves emerged, not all at once. That would have been dramatic, but tactically foolish. Instead, they appeared in stages, each group covering the next, until Mrs. Blackwood's force found itself not surrounding, but surrounded. "Dear God," Sheriff Daniels whispered, his face going pale as he recognized many of the armed men. The banker from Colville, the freedman farrier, the Chinese laundryman. Men he'd dismissed, ignored, or actively mistreated, now standing with rifles trained and steady. Mrs. Blackwood's horse shied as she jerked the reins in shock. "This is impossible. Where did they all come from?" "We've been here all along," Marcus Thompson called out from his position. "You just never bothered to really see us." Too busy counting your money to notice the men who actually built this territory. Colton, to his credit, didn't panic. His hands stayed visible, away from his weapons, as he assessed the situation with a professional's eye. "Well played. Bennett," he said, almost conversationally. "The old Cherokee Sunrise Formation, if I'm not mistaken. We used something similar at Brandy Station." "With a few improvements," Joshua acknowledged. "Stand down. Colton, this doesn't have to end in blood." "You know it does," Colton replied sadly. "It always does. With men like us, we're what they made us. You and I, tools for violence, dressed up as civilization." "We're more than that," Joshua said, and Clara heard the conviction in his voice. "We can choose to be more. You rode with honor once. Henry, you can again." For a moment, the tableau held. Two forces balanced on the edge of violence, waiting for someone to make the fatal move. The morning sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the ground that would soon be contested. Then one of Colton's men, younger and more nervous than the rest, made a mistake. His horse shifted, his hand dropped toward his gun, and 43 rifles swung toward him with mechanical precision. "Nobody move," Joshua commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "First man to draw dies, and the second man dies a heartbeat later. We've got overlapping fields of fire, elevated positions, and men who've sent more souls to judgment than you've had hot dinners. Think very carefully about your next choice." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Clara found herself holding her breath, her hand steady on the rifle Joshua had given her, aimed at a man who couldn't have been older than 20, just a boy, really, hired to play at being dangerous in a game where the other players had written the rules in blood. "Mrs. Blackwood," Joshua continued, never taking his eyes off Colton. "You wanted to see what I really am? Take a good look. I'm a man who's killed for worse reasons than protecting his home, and I'll do it again if you force me. But I'm also a man who's tired of killing, who wants nothing more than to raise cattle and children in peace. The choice is yours." "This is outrageous," Mrs. Blackwood shrieked. "Sheriff, do something!" But Daniels was staring at Samuel Chen, who had the sheriff covered with a rifle that looked lovingly maintained. I think we should discuss this like civilized folks," the sheriff stammered. "Civilized?" William Thornton laughed from his position. "That's rich, coming from a man who's taken Blackwood bribes for 3 years. We've got the receipts, Daniels. Every payment, every dirty deal, every time you looked the other way while honest folk got ground under her heel." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. "Mrs." Blackwood's men began to exchange glances, realizing they might be on the wrong side of more than just this morning's standoff. "You're bluffing, Mrs." Blackwood said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Am I?" Joshua reached into his shirt and pulled out a leather portfolio. Sworn statements from 24 witnesses, bank records showing payments from your accounts to the sheriffs, even a signed confession from Tom Garrett about the tax scheme you've been running. He smiled coldly. "You wanted to play with law and paper? Fine, but you should have remembered that soldiers keep very good records. It's how we survived when the politicians wanted to throw us away." Colton had been silent through this exchange, but now he spoke up. "Ma'am, I'd say you've been outmaneuvered. My professional advice? Accept whatever terms Sergeant Bennett offers, because if this goes hot, most of us won't live to see noon, and that includes you." "You coward, Mrs." Blackwood spat. "I paid you to—" "You paid me to deal with a simple rancher," Colton interrupted. "This isn't simple, and that's no rancher. That's a gray wolf alpha standing on his own ground with his pack around him. I've seen what happens to those who threaten a wolf's den. It's not pretty, and it's not survivable." The sun climbed higher, and Clara could see sweat beading on faces despite the morning cool. Fingers tensed on triggers, muscles coiled for action. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then, from the road behind Mrs. Blackwood's force came the sound of many horses, Everyone tensed, weapons swinging toward this new threat, until they saw who was leading them. Judge Harold McKenna, Silas's younger brother, rode at the head of a column of territorial marshals, the federal lawmen spread out with practiced efficiency, effectively boxing in misses. Blackwood's force between them and the Grey Wolves. "Nobody shoot!" the judge called out, his voice carrying the authority of legitimate law. "This is a federal matter now. Mrs. Blackwood, Sheriff Daniels, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and about a dozen other charges that'll keep lawyers busy for years." The relief was palpable. Clara felt her knees go weak as weapons slowly lowered around the clearing. She'd been prepared to fight, to kill if necessary. But thank God it wouldn't be necessary. "You planned this," Colton said to Joshua, something like admiration in his voice. "The whole thing. You knew I'd come early, knew Blackwood would overplay her hand, knew the judge was coming." Joshua shrugged. "I planned for possibilities. You taught me that. In a way, every time we fought, I learned something. Shame we had to be enemies." "Yeah," Colton agreed softly. "Shame about a lot of things." As the marshals moved in to make arrests, Mrs. Blackwood's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't do this! I own this town! I own all of you!" "No, ma'am," Judge McKenna said firmly. "You own property. These folks own something more valuable, each other's loyalty. That's something all your money could never buy." The standoff dissolved into controlled chaos as weapons were collected, arrests were made, and the Grey Wolves emerged fully from their positions. Clara watched it all from the porch, her rifle now hanging loose in her hands. As the Empire misses, Blackwood had built on threats and corruption came apart in the morning sun. Joshua appeared beside her, solid and warm and alive. "You all right?" "I think so," Clara said, then more firmly, Yes, I am." Around them, men who'd prepared for war found themselves laughing with relief, clasping hands, renewing bonds that had never really broken. The Grey Wolves had answered the whistle's call one last time, and in doing so, had perhaps finally found the peace they'd been seeking since the war ended. The sun was fully up now, painting the ranch in golden light. It was going to be a beautiful day. The territorial courthouse in Silver Creek had never seen such a crowd. Every bench was packed, people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Clara sat in the front row, her hands folded over the slight swell of her belly that had begun to show in the 2 months since the standoff at their ranch. Judge Harold McKenna presided with stern authority, his gavel having to fall repeatedly to maintain order as witness after witness testified to years of corruption, intimidation, and worse, misses. Blackwood sat at the defendant's table, her once proud bearing diminished, her expensive dress looking somehow shabby in the harsh light of justice. "Mr. Bennett," the prosecutor said, "please tell the court about the events leading up to the confrontation at your ranch." Joshua stood in the witness box, wearing his best clothes, which were still simple rancher's garb, but clean and pressed by Clara's careful hands. He looked uncomfortable with all the attention, but his voice was steady as he began to speak. "It started when I refused to sell my land to Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "She offered a price that was insulting, less than half what the property was worth. When I declined, she said I'd regret it." "And did you?" "She tried to make me regret it," Joshua corrected. "False tax bills, harassment, destruction of property. Sheriff Daniels there ignored every complaint I filed, said it was probably drifters or my imagination." From his seat among the defendants, Daniels couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The former sheriff had broken completely when faced with the evidence the Grey Wolves had compiled. Years of meticulous records kept by men who understood that documentation could be as powerful as ammunition. Then came the night attack. Joshua continued. "Tom Garrett and a dozen men trying to burn us out. That's when I realized this wasn't going to stop unless I made it stop." "So you called your associates?" Joshua's jaw tightened slightly. I called men I'd served with, men who understood what it meant to stand against bullies and tyrants. We didn't want violence, we wanted justice, but we were prepared to defend ourselves if necessary. The prosecutor nodded, moving on to introduce the financial records that Samuel Chen and Marcus Thompson had painstakingly assembled. The paper trail was damning. Bribes, fraudulent documents, a pattern of systematic theft dressed up as legal process. But it was when Henry Colton took the stand that the courtroom truly fell silent. The former Confederate operative had made a deal with the federal prosecutors, agreeing to testify in exchange for immunity. He sat in the witness chair like a man at confession, his scarred face grave. "Mrs. Blackwood hired me to eliminate Joshua Bennett," he said bluntly. "Not arrest, not intimidate, eliminate. She knew he was the only one in the valley with the courage and capability to stand against her, and she wanted him dead." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara felt her hands clench involuntarily. She knew about my history with Sergeant Bennett. Colton continued. "Thought my personal grudge would make me eager for the job." She was wrong. He looked directly at Joshua. "The war's been over for 12 years. I've spent most of that time trying to forget what I did during it. When I saw Bennett ready to defend his home, surrounded by men willing to die for him, I remembered what it was like to fight for something worth believing in." "Are you saying you refused to carry out the contract?" the prosecutor asked. "I'm saying I remembered that I used to be a soldier, not a murderer." Colton replied, "There's a difference, though it's easy to forget when people with money wave it in your face." The testimony continued for hours. Ranchers who'd lost their land to Blackwood's schemes, families driven out by violence, a whole ledger of cruelty written in legal terminology and enforced by corrupted law. When Mrs. Blackwood finally took the stand in her own defense, her story fell apart under cross-examination. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she tried to shift blame. It was Garrett's idea. Daniels had suggested the tax scheme. She was just a widow trying to build security in a harsh world. "You speak of harsh worlds," the prosecutor said coldly. "Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood, how harsh was it for the Pemberton family when your men burned their barn with their milk cow still inside? How harsh was it for old Charlie Banks when he was beaten for refusing to sell his water rights?" "I never ordered violence," Mrs. Blackwood insisted. "No? Then explain this." The prosecutor produced a letter in Mrs. Blackwood's own hand. "Deal with the Bennett problem permanently. I don't care how. Just make sure he's not a problem by month's end." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Blackwood's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Clara found herself called to testify about the night attack, about the threats made against her. She kept her testimony factual, resisting the urge to pour out all the fear and anger she'd felt. The facts were damning enough without embellishment. "They destroyed our property, scattered our animals, threatened our lives," she said clearly. "All because we wouldn't bow to Mrs. Blackwood's demands. My husband built our ranch with his own hands, paid for it with honest money. We had every right to defend it." "Some would say your husband overreacted," the defense attorney suggested, "calling in dozens of armed men." "Armed men who never fired a shot," Clara interrupted. "Who showed more restraint in the face of aggression than Mrs. Blackwood's hired thugs showed against unarmed families. My husband called for help from men he trusted." "That's not a crime, that's wisdom." When all testimony was complete, Judge McKenna's verdict was swift and harsh. Mrs. Blackwood was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, corruption, attempted murder, and a host of lesser charges. The sentence was 20 years in territorial prison, with restitution to be paid to all her victims from the sale of her ill-gotten assets. Sheriff Daniels received 10 years, his badge stripped away in open court. Tom Garrett and the other enforcers got varying sentences based on their level of involvement. Only Henry Colton walked free, his immunity agreement honored despite grumbles from the crowd. As they filed out of the courthouse, Colton approached Joshua. The two men studied each other for a long moment. history hanging between them like a ghost. "I'm heading west," Colton said finally. "California, maybe. Somewhere the past doesn't follow quite so close." "Good luck to you," Joshua said, and meant it. Colton started to leave, then turned back. "That whistle call, the silver one, it means something, doesn't it? More than just a signal." "It means brothers stand together." Joshua replied, "It means promises kept and loyalty honored. It means no one fights alone." "I had something like that once," Colton said softly. "Lost it somewhere between Virginia and here. Maybe I'll find it again out west." He walked away without another word, a gray figure disappearing into the afternoon crowd. The town square was full of people celebrating justice finally done. The gray wolves were there, laughing and embracing, their deadly skills packed away again beneath the surfaces of ordinary lives. Clara saw Samuel Chen teaching some children a game with stones, his hands that could assemble a rifle in darkness now gentle with the little ones. William Thornton was helping repair a wagon wheel, his massive strength turned to constructive purpose. Marcus Thompson was already making plans with other merchants to ensure fair distribution of goods now that Blackwood's monopolistic practices were ended. "It's over," Clara said, leaning into Joshua's solid presence. "This part is," he agreed. "Now comes the harder work, building something better in the space she left, making sure the next Blackwood doesn't get a foothold." Judge McKenna approached them, Silas at his side grinning like a prospector who'd struck gold. "Bennett," the judge said, shaking Joshua's hand, "the territorial governor asked me to sound you out about something. We need a new sheriff, someone with integrity who can't be bought. Interested?" Joshua looked surprised. "I'm a rancher. Judge, I've got no interest in wearing a badge." "Think about it," McKenna urged. "The town trusts you. More importantly, the kind of men who might cause trouble know your reputation now. Sometimes the best peace officer is the one who doesn't have to enforce the peace because folks don't dare disturb it." After the judge moved on, Clara and Joshua stood together watching the celebration. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of victory and promise. "Would you consider it?" Clara asked, "being sheriff?" "I've got everything I want," Joshua said, his hand resting gently on her growing belly. "A home, a wife I love, a child on the way. Why would I complicate that with a badge?" "Because you're a protector," Clara said simply. "It's who you are, whether you're wearing a uniform or not. And this town, these people, they're ours now. Part of the pack, as your wolves would say." Joshua was quiet for a long moment. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "But tonight, I just want to go home with my wife and enjoy the peace we fought for." As they walked toward their wagon, people called out thanks and congratulations. Men tipped their hats. Women smiled warmly. Even those who had whispered behind Clara's back now looked at her with newfound respect. She had stood beside her husband against the storm. And in this frontier world, that counted for everything. The silver whistle still hung around Joshua's neck, catching the last light of day. But it was quiet now. Its call answered, its purpose served. The gray wolves had risen one last time. Not for war, but for justice. Not for violence, but for peace. And, in the end, that made all the difference. 5 years had passed since the morning when 43 gray wolves answered the silver whistle's call. The Bennett Ranch had grown prosperous, its pastures dotted with healthy cattle, its modest house expanded to accommodate a growing family. Clara stood on the porch, watching her children play in the yard. 4-year-old Thomas, sturdy and serious like his father, and 2-year-old Sarah, who had her mother's fierce spirit and stubborn chin. The transformation of Silver Creek had been remarkable. Where once Mrs. Blackwood's mansion had loomed over the town like a fortress of greed. There now stood a school, built with funds from the sale of her seized assets, where corrupt Sheriff Daniels had held court. Joshua Bennett now wore the badge, having finally accepted the position after a year of the townsfolk's persistent requests. "Papa's coming!" Thomas shouted, pointing at the dust cloud approaching from town. Clara smiled, shading her eyes. Even at this distance, she could recognize Joshua's easy seat in the saddle, the way he moved as one with his horse. Some things hadn't changed. He still preferred working cattle to wearing a badge, still sang to the horses when he thought no one was listening, still looked at her like she'd hung the moon and stars. But other things had transformed completely. The town that had once whispered about her poor choice now regarded the Bennetts with deep respect. The former society belle who'd thrown herself away on a simple rancher had become the woman who'd stood rifle in hand beside her husband against tyranny. Joshua dismounted at the gate, and the children ran to him, Sarah's chubby legs pumping determinedly to keep up with her brother. He scooped them both up, one in each arm, their delighted squeals echoing across the ranch. "Any trouble in town?" Clara asked as he climbed the porch steps, still carrying the children. "Nothing but good trouble," Joshua grinned, setting the little ones down. "Sam Chen's oldest boy got accepted to that college back east. The whole family's beside themselves with pride. And Marcus Thompson's expanding his store again, says he needs more room for all the new settlers coming in." It was true. Word had spread about Silver Creek, about the town where justice had prevailed over corruption, where men of all backgrounds stood together against tyranny. Families seeking fresh starts arrived monthly, drawn by stories of a place where honest work was rewarded and the law served everyone equally. "There's something else," Joshua said, reaching into his vest. "Letter came. From California." Clara recognized the handwriting immediately. Henry Colton. The Confederate soldier who'd chosen conscience over contract had written sporadically over the years. His letters spoke of redemption sought and sometimes found, of building a new life among the orange groves. Joshua read aloud. "Bennett, thought you should know I've started something out here. A group for men like us. Men who've seen too much war and need to remember there's more to life than violence. We meet monthly, talk about the old days and the new ones, help each other stay on the right path. I call us the Silver Whistles. Hope you don't mind. That morning at your ranch, when I saw what you'd built with your gray wolves, not a force for war but a brotherhood for peace, it changed something in me. Man can choose to be more than his worst moments. Thanks for showing me that. H. Colton." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Even in victory, there was redemption to be found. "Uncle Marcus! Uncle William!" Thomas shouted suddenly, and Clara looked up to see riders approaching. Not just Thompson and Thornton, but a dozen of the Grey Wolves, arriving as they did every year on this date, the anniversary of the standoff. They came not as warriors now, but as friends, bringing their families for what had become an annual celebration. Samuel Chen arrived with his wife and 3 children, the eldest already showing signs of his father's quick intelligence. The freedman farrier brought his new bride, a schoolteacher who'd arrived on one of the settler wagons and fallen for his quiet dignity. Soon the ranch was full of life. Women organized food on long tables while men set up games for the children. The talk was of crops and cattle, of children's achievements and plans for the future. Normal conversation for normal people who'd once been something extraordinary and might be again if needed. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Joshua stood and raised his hand for silence. It was time for the annual tradition, the moment that gave their gathering its deeper meaning. He pulled out the silver whistle, its surface polished by years of handling but the engraving still clear. "5 years ago," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "we answered a call, not for war, but for justice, not for violence, but for peace. We stood together when standing alone would have meant destruction." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. These people had risked everything for each other and found their lives enriched by the gamble. "Some folks wonder why we still meet," Joshua continued. "Why we still carry the whistles, still remember the signals. Mrs. Blackwood is in prison. The corruption's been cleaned out. We won." He paused, looking at each face. But we meet because victory isn't just about defeating enemies. It's about what you build after. It's about making sure the next generation knows that strength comes from standing together. That honor matters more than profit. That a person's worth isn't measured in dollars, but in the trust of their neighbors. He raised the whistle to his lips and played the calling song one more time. Not as a summons to battle now, but as a reminder. The notes rolled across the evening air, and one by one, the other wolves pulled out their whistles, silver, brass, even a few wooden ones carved by those who'd lost their originals, and joined in. The children watched with wide eyes as their fathers and mothers created a symphony of remembrance. This was their inheritance, not just the prosperity that justice had brought, but the knowledge that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood together. "Tell the story, Papa," Sarah demanded when the music ended, climbing onto Joshua's lap. It was her favorite, though she was too young to understand its true weight. Joshua smiled, settling her comfortably. "Once upon a time," he began, as the other children gathered around. "There was a rancher who just wanted to raise cattle and love his family, but bad people tried to take away his home." The adults listened, too, some adding their own details to the familiar tale. With each telling, it grew and changed, becoming legend while the truth still lived in the hearts of those who'd been there. Clara found herself standing with Martha Thompson and the other wives, watching their husbands transform history into story for young ears. "Do you think they'll understand?" Martha asked. "When they're older, what their fathers really did?" "They'll understand what matters," Clara replied. "That good people standing together can overcome evil standing alone. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. That sometimes a whistle in the dark is enough to change everything." As night fell, lanterns were lit and the gathering continued. Stories were shared, not just of the standoff, but of all the years since. The school Sam Chen's son would attend. The businesses that thrived now that fair dealing was the law. The families that had found homes here because justice had made room for them. "You know what I've been thinking?" William Thornton said, his bass voice rumbling in the lantern light. "We should write it down. All of it. Not just the exciting parts, but the whole truth. So, when we're gone, the story remains." "I've been keeping a journal," Clara offered. "Since the beginning. Everything I've seen. Everything Joshua's told me about the before times." "Then that's our next project," Marcus Thompson declared. "The true history of the Grey Wolves and the Silver Whistle. Let future generations know that democracy isn't just about voting. It's about citizens willing to stand up when the system fails." As the evening wound down and families began to drift toward home, or the rooms prepared for those traveling far, Joshua and Clara stood together on their porch. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the prairie sky. "Any regrets?" Joshua asked, his arm around her waist. Clara thought of the life she'd given up, the servants, the silk dresses, the social position. Then she looked at what she'd gained, a husband who'd proven his worth 1,000 times over, children born free and proud, a community forged in the crucible of shared struggle. "Not one," she said firmly. "I was shamed for marrying a simple rancher. They never knew I was marrying a man who could summon an army with a whistle. Not for conquest, but for justice. I'd make the same choice again. Even knowing all the trouble it brought? Especially knowing that you showed me what real honor looks like. Joshua Bennett. What real love looks like. A woman would be a fool to trade that for comfort." In the house, their children slept, dreaming perhaps of silver whistles and midnight rides. Around them, the ranch stood peaceful, no longer threatened by greed or corruption. And across 3 states, men and women who'd answered a call kept faith with each other and the ideals that bound them. The silver whistle caught the moonlight as Joshua tucked it back inside his shirt. Its work was done for now, but it remained ready, because the price of peace, as every Grey Wolf knew, was eternal vigilance and the willingness to stand together when the darkness came calling. Some would always see Joshua Bennett as just a simple rancher who'd gotten lucky. But those who knew the truth, who'd seen 43 souls rise from the prairie grass like avenging angels, understood that sometimes the greatest strength looked like simplicity. The deepest waters ran still, and the most powerful army was the one you'd never see coming until that silver whistle sang its song across the valley. The legend would grow with each telling, as legends do, but at its heart would always be the truth Clara had discovered that day in the courthouse. She hadn't married beneath her station. She'd married a man who showed an entire territory what it meant to stand tall, fight fair, and never, ever stand alone. And that was worth more than all the gold in California.